circumstances shape people's behavior. And the choices people make sometimes can be social choices, collective, and they tend to last over time. So that we talk about cultural dispositions or legacies. These are social choices because they reflect massive cultures, popular cultures. They even sometimes reflect strategic cultures, how leaders think about how their country should conduct itself in the world of international relations. Now, I just mentioned the word environment. Environment refers to milieu, context, or if you will, the physical circumstances that a people or country finds itself in. Let me introduce some further examples that your book does not talk about. Let me continue with the analogy or metaphor of food, of menu. Think about the United States 200 years ago, 300 years ago. What would be the ecology or environment of the United States? The United States would be a country with lots of land, fertile land, but relatively few inhabitants, few people. Contrast that picture of the United States with that of China, or for that matter, India. There, in these countries, India and China, land was scarce relative to the number of people. There are far more people to support given the available amount of land that can be cultivated. It is not difficult to imagine that under the circumstances, that for the Chinese, for example, grazing of cow, ranching, would be difficult. Why? Very simply put, cattle would eat grass, and pasture that is devoted to the growing of grass for the raising of cattle would be unavailable for the cultivation of rice. So in that sense, then, cattle and human beings would be in competition. The land that goes to raising cattle would not be available to feed the people. It therefore seems reasonable to conclude that given this environment of lots of people, not so much land, the Chinese would not go for ranching cattle. So that beef, for instance, is not going to be on the top of the Chinese cultural diet. Instead, pork eating would be more popular. And why? Again, it has to do with the environment. Environmental probabilism is the idea suggesting, the concept suggesting that given certain environment, certain social choices, cultural dispositions are likely to follow. And pork eating, given the Chinese environment, traditional Chinese environment, is a more likely outcome because unlike cows, unlike cattle, pigs do not eat grass. In fact, pigs are scavengers. They eat trash, garbage, and as a result, raising pigs would be far less demanding on the human beings on the need to grow rice. And therefore, there is now the custom of emphasizing pork rather than beef in the Chinese traditional diet. It makes sense, therefore, that cheesecake, ice cream were not invented in China. Now go back to the United States scenario, where there was a lot of land but relatively few people. Obviously, that set of circumstances or environment makes it more probable, again, I'm raising the concept of environmental probabilism, makes it more probable for the people there to engage in ranching, where you raise cattle, herd cattle, over a very large expanse of land, demanding few people, few hands of labor to manage a very large piece of land. Whereas in the case of China and for that matter India, labor intensive production becomes more important. And given the prevalence of labor-intensive production, both in India and China, human labor, given the large number of people, human labor is relatively cheap. Therefore, there is less need to invent machinery to save labor. In contrast, in the case of the United States, because there are fewer people, labor will be more expensive, and consequently, when we infer that, there will be greater incentive to invent machines to replace human labor, because labor is more expensive. Therefore, there is a reason why John Deere and International Harvester, for example, prospered, thrived, were created in the United States as opposed to China or India, where labor was cheap. And it stands to reason also, given the discrepancy between the number of people and the amount of land, cattle raising was a more widely practiced method of farming in the United States, and because of this, it stands to reason, for example, beef eating, hamburgers are more popular in the United States than, let's say, in China. There are other dietary circumstances and preferences that derive from the physical environment, the circumstances that different people find themselves in. Let me just give you some more examples to illustrate some of these tendencies. In the case of India, for example, all of you know, there is the taboo against eating beef. Why? One possibility is that cattle provides traction in order to grow rice. Shortly after the monsoon season, Indian farmers traditionally needed their cows to prepare the land for planting. Those families that eat cattle would not have these animals to plow the land. Therefore, they face the risk of starvation next year. So, eating beef could be very, very self-destructive. It is not a good long-term way to protect your family. Therefore, this custom of taboo against beef eating reflects again the environment in which the Indian farmers had to traditionally operate, the need for cattle to provide traction for preparing the land. To use yet another example, in the Middle East, people do not eat pork. Why? Some scholars have argued that the ecology, again, the environment of the Middle East has something to do with this taboo against eating pork. If you believe that historically people in the Middle East are nomadic, they travel from one place to another, then this style of life, this way of life, could be challenged by a tend to eating pork, because you can very well imagine horses, camels, cattle, and even goats can travel when you move from one place to another, having a nomadic way of life. Pigs actually cannot travel, and as a result, pig eating or pork eating then becomes contrary to the way of life, the nomadic way of life, the ecology of the Middle East. To provide you one more example, and perhaps an example that some of you may find offensive, disgusting even. Some of you may have seen the movie Apocalypto, directed by Mel Gibson. You may wonder why the people of South America, right, the Aztecs, the Incas, for example, would fight wars. And fight wars not necessarily to conquer the territory of other people, but rather to seize prisoners of war. And they go through a lot of trouble to take these prisoners back home, where they would be subjected to ritual killing, right? Human sacrifice at the top of the pyramids. Some anthropologists argue that this practice of human sacrifice had something to do with the environment of South America, meaning that, according to these anthropologists, South America did not have large animals, large games, in contrast to other parts of the world. And this lack of large games, cows, camels, even horses,